Imagine if I told you that democracy, philosophy, theater, the Olympics, and even the word history itself all came from one small region that's smaller than the state of Florida. That's ancient Greece, a civilization so influential that we're still living in its shadow over 2,000 years later. Every time you vote, watch a movie, go to the gym, or even say the word democracy, you're participating in Greek culture. But here's what's wild. Ancient Greece wasn't actually a country. It was more like, imagine if instead of the United States, North America was filled with hundreds of independent cities that shared the same language and culture, but constantly fought each other. New York City would have its own army, Boston would have different laws, and Texas would probably try to conquer everyone else. That was Greece. Today, we're going through the entire 2,000-year journey of ancient Greece, from mysterious Bronze Age palaces to Alexander the Great's world conquest. We'll see how a bunch of quarreling city-states became the foundation of Western civilization. And trust me, this story has more plot twists than a Netflix series. So grab some olive oil and wine. We're going back to where it all began. Our story starts around 2700 BCE on the island of Crete with people we call the Minoans, named after the legendary King Minos and his maze-dwelling Minotaur. But here's the thing, we don't actually know what they called themselves because we can't read their writing system. The Minoans were like the cool, peaceful, older siblings of Greek civilization. While everyone else was hitting each other with bronze weapons, the Minoans were building massive palaces with indoor plumbing, flushing toilets, and elaborate frescoes of dolphins and bull-jumping athletes. Think of them as the ancient world's version of that wealthy friend whose house has a pool, game room, and parents who are never home. Their palace at Knossos was so complex that it probably inspired the labyrinth myth. They traded with everyone, loved art, and seemed to worship a snake goddess because, apparently, ancient civilizations had a thing for dangerous animals. But around 1450 BCE, something happened. Maybe it was a natural disaster, maybe invasion, maybe both. The Minoan civilization essentially vanished, leaving behind only their incredible palaces and a writing system we still can't crack. Enter the Mycenaeans, the actual ancestors of the classical Greeks we know and love. If the Minoans were the cool, peaceful, older siblings of Greek civilization, the Mycenaeans were the warriors who watched too much Game of Thrones. They built massive fortress cities with walls so thick that later Greeks thought they must have been built by one-eyed giants called Cyclops. The Mycenaeans loved three things: warfare, gold, and writing everything down in a script called Linear B, which, unlike Minoan Linear A, we can actually read. And here's where it gets interesting. The Mycenaeans are probably the people Homer was writing about in the Iliad. That legendary Trojan War? There's actually archaeological evidence that something like it really happened around 1200 BCE. But just as the Mycenaeans were hitting their stride, everything fell apart.
Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age Mediterranean had what archaeologists call the Late Bronze Age collapse. Basically, it was like someone pulled the plug on civilization itself. Within a few decades, every major power from Greece to Egypt either collapsed entirely or barely survived. The Mycenaean palaces were burned and abandoned, writing disappeared, trade networks collapsed. It was like society hit the reset button. What caused this collapse? Honestly, we're not entirely sure. Climate change, invasions by mysterious sea peoples, internal warfare, economic collapse, probably all of the above. It's like trying to figure out why every social media platform failed simultaneously. For the next 400 years, Greece entered what we call the Dark Ages. And not just because we don't know much about this period. The population dropped dramatically, cities were abandoned, People forgot how to write. It was like a civilization-wide amnesia. But here's the amazing thing about human resilience. Even in the darkness, seeds of something new were growing. Small communities survived in remote valleys. They kept telling stories, the same stories that would eventually become Homer's epics. They maintained religious traditions, and slowly, very slowly, they began to rebuild. Think of it like this. Imagine if modern civilization collapsed, but people kept telling stories about Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg for 400 years, until someone finally wrote them down as epic poems about digital heroes. That's essentially what happened with the Trojan War stories. By 800 BCE, the Greeks were ready for their comeback. And what a comeback it would be.
Around 800 BCE, the Greeks made one of the most important discoveries in human history. They figured out how to write again. But this time, they borrowed the Phoenician alphabet and made it better by adding vowels. This was like upgrading from dial-up internet to broadband. Suddenly, stories that had been passed down orally for centuries could be preserved. Someone, probably multiple someones, wrote down the Iliad and the Odyssey. These weren't just entertainment. They were like the ancient Greek Wikipedia, Netflix, and moral guidebook, all rolled into one. But the real game changer was the rise of the polis, the city-state. Instead of rebuilding large kingdoms like the Mycenaeans had, the Greeks created something revolutionary: independent cities that controlled their surrounding territory. Each polis was like a sovereign nation. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, they all had their own governments, their own armies, their own currencies, and their own patron gods. It was like if every major city in America was its own country with its own president. This led to an explosion of experimentation in government. Some cities had kings, others had aristocracies, and some, like Athens, began experimenting with this radical idea called democracy, where citizens actually got to vote on things. But population was growing, and Greece is mostly mountains and islands. There wasn't enough farmland to support everyone. So the Greeks did what ambitious people have always done when they outgrow their hometown. They moved. Between 750 and 550 BCE, the Greeks established colonies all around the Mediterranean and Black Sea. From Spain to the Crimea, from France to Libya, Greek cities sprouted up like ancient Starbucks. These weren't conquests, they were new independent cities founded by immigrants looking for better opportunities. This colonization period was like the ancient version of the California gold rush, except instead of gold, they were seeking fertile land, trade opportunities, and freedom from overcrowded mother cities. The most important thing about this period? Competition. With hundreds of independent Greek cities constantly competing, innovating, and trying to outdo each other, innovation accelerated. It was like having hundreds of Silicon Valley startups all working on the same problems simultaneously. Some cities specialized in trade, others in warfare, others in art or philosophy. Corinth became the ancient world's shipping hub. Sparta turned into a military machine. Athens became a center of learning and democracy. But this competition had a dark side. Greeks fought Greeks constantly. They shared language, religion, and culture, but they could never unite politically. It was like a family that gets along great at reunions, but constantly argues over inheritance. And speaking of warfare, the Greeks revolutionized that too. They developed hoplite warfare, heavily armored citizen soldiers fighting in tight formations called phalanxes. This wasn't just a military innovation, it was social revolution. To be a hoplite, you had to be wealthy enough to buy your own armor, which meant the middle class suddenly became the backbone of military power. When your military depends on middle-class citizens, those citizens start demanding political rights. It's hard to tell someone they can't vote when you need them to die for the city next week.
Just as the Greeks were hitting their stride, a new player entered the game, and it was huge. The Persian Empire, under Cyrus the Great and later Darius I, had conquered everything from India to Egypt. They were the ancient world's superpower, controlling roughly 40% of the global population. To put this in perspective, imagine if one country today controlled China,
India, the Middle East, and half of Africa. That was Persia in 500 BCE. And now they were looking west at these tiny, quarreling Greek cities. The trouble started in 499 BCE, when the Greek cities on the coast of Asia Minor, modern Turkey, rebelled against Persian rule. Athens and another city called Eretria sent help, about 20 ships total. To the Persians, this was like someone throwing pebbles at a tank. But those pebbles included burning down the Persian regional capital of Sardis. King Darius was not amused. According to the historian Herodotus, Darius had a servant remind him 3 times every day, "Master, remember the Athenians." In 490 BCE, the Persians sent a punitive expedition across the Aegean. They destroyed Eretria and then landed at Marathon, about 25 miles from Athens. The Athenians were outnumbered roughly 2 to 1, and their Spartan allies were delayed by religious obligations, because, apparently, even existential military crises had to wait for religious festivals. What happened next became legendary. The Athenian general Miltiades came up with a brilliant strategy. He weakened his center and strengthened his flanks, then charged the Persians at a full run, something nobody did in ancient warfare because you'd arrive exhausted. But it worked. The Persian center pushed forward, thinking they were winning, only to be surrounded when the strengthened Greek flanks closed in like a deadly hug. The Persians were routed, losing around 6,400 men, while the Greeks lost only 192. A messenger named Phidippides ran the 25 miles from Marathon to Athens to announce the victory, then collapsed and died, giving us the modern marathon race. Though honestly, he probably would have been fine if he just sent a text. Darius was now really angry, but he died before he could get revenge. His son Xerxes inherited both the throne and the grudge. Xerxes decided that this time he wouldn't send an expedition. He'd personally lead the largest army ever assembled in ancient history. In 480 BCE, Xerxes marched with an army that ancient sources claim numbered in the millions. Probably an exaggeration, but even conservative modern estimates put it at 150,000 to 200,000 troops. He built bridges across the Hellespont, dug a canal through a peninsula, and brought soldiers from dozens of different nations. This time, the Greeks realized they needed to work together or die separately. Led by Sparta and Athens, about 30 Greek cities formed the Hellenic League, basically ancient NATO, but with more olive oil and philosophical arguments. The Greeks chose to make their first stand at Thermopylae, a narrow mountain pass where terrain would negate the Persian numerical advantage. It was like choosing to fight in a narrow hallway so only one person could attack you at a time. King Leonidas of Sparta led 300 Spartans, plus several thousand other Greeks, to hold the pass. When Xerxes demanded that the Greeks surrender their weapons, Leonidas supposedly replied, "Come and take them," the ancient equivalent of "Try me, bro." For 3 days the Greeks held. The Persians couldn't break through. Xerxes was so frustrated that when someone told him Persian arrows would blot out the sun, a Spartan warrior named Dionychus reportedly said, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." But ultimately, a local Greek showed the Persians a mountain path around the pass. Realizing they were about to be surrounded, Leonidas sent most of the Greeks away, but stayed with his 300 Spartans and about 1,000 other Greeks for a final stand. They fought to the last man. When it was over, Xerxes was so angry that he had Leonidas's head cut off and stuck on a spike, which was considered seriously disrespectful by ancient standards. But the sacrifice bought time for the Greek fleet to prepare and for Athens to evacuate its population. When Xerxes finally reached Athens, he found an empty city, which he burned in frustration. The real decisive battle happened at sea near the island of Salamis.
The Athenian leader Themistocles tricked Xerxes into fighting in the narrow waters between Salamis and the mainland, where the massive Persian fleet couldn't maneuver properly. The result was a devastating Persian defeat. Xerxes watched from a throne on the shore as his supposedly invincible navy was destroyed. He sailed back to Asia, leaving behind an army under his general Mardonius. The following year, the remaining Persian army was destroyed at the Battle of Plataea. Against all odds, the tiny Greek city-states had defeated the greatest empire on earth.
Victory over Persia did something unprecedented. It gave the Greeks, especially the Athenians, massive confidence and a lot of Persian treasure to spend. What followed was one of the most remarkable periods in human history, the Golden Age of Athens. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens became what we might call the first global cultural superpower. It was like if New York, Silicon Valley, and Hollywood all merged into one city and then started inventing everything. Athens in the 5th century BCE was where democracy was perfected, where philosophy was born, where the greatest plays ever written were performed, and where art reached heights that still make us gasp today. Let's talk about that democracy for a second. Athenian democracy wasn't like our democracy. It was direct democracy. Citizens didn't elect representatives. They showed up to the agora and voted on everything personally. Imagine if instead of Congress, every major decision was made by a giant town hall meeting. Of course, citizens meant free adult males whose parents were both Athenian, so maybe 40,000 people out of a total population of 250,000. Women, slaves, and foreigners couldn't participate. It was revolutionary for its time, but it would seem pretty exclusive today. The Athenians even had a process called ostracism, where once a year they could vote to exile any citizen for 10 years. No trial, no charges, just, we think you're getting too powerful, so goodbye. It was like democratic cancel culture with actual exile. But the cultural achievements were extraordinary. This is when Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were writing tragedies that are still performed today. These weren't just entertainment. They were examining fundamental questions about justice, power, fate, and human nature. Imagine going to the theater and seeing the world premiere of Oedipus Rex. The audience would have been participating in a civic duty. Theater attendance was considered as important as jury duty. And then there was philosophy. Before the Greeks, people explained the world through mythology and religion. The Greeks invented the radical idea that you could understand the universe through reason and observation. Socrates wandered around Athens asking people uncomfortable questions about what they thought they knew. He was like that friend who always asks, "But why?" until you realize you don't actually understand anything. His student Plato founded the Academy, basically the world's first university. Plato's student Aristotle then tutored a young prince named Alexander, but we'll get to him later. The architecture was revolutionary too. The Parthenon, built during this period, used mathematical principles to create optical illusions that make it appear perfectly straight and proportional from a distance. It's like ancient Instagram filters, but in marble. Athens was also becoming incredibly wealthy. After the Persian Wars, Athens had created the Delian League, supposedly an alliance to protect against future Persian attacks, but in reality, it was ancient protection racket. Nice island you got there. Shame if something happened to it. How about you contribute ships or money to our mutual defense fund? The alliance's treasury was moved from the island of Delos to Athens for safekeeping, and Athens started spending the money on Athenian projects. It was like if NATO's budget was used to build monuments in Washington, D.C. This imperial behavior made other Greek cities nervous, especially Sparta. Athens and Sparta had been allies against Persia, but they couldn't have been more different. Athens was democratic, commercial, intellectual, and naval.
Sparta was oligarchic, agricultural, military, and land-based. Athens celebrated individual achievement. Sparta valued collective discipline. Athens had philosophers. Sparta had warriors. It was like if San Francisco and a military academy were both city-states. Tensions escalated throughout the mid-5th century. Both cities gathered allies, creating two opposing power blocks. It was like the Cold War, but with more olive oil and philosophical debates about justice. The breaking point came in 431 BCE, when fighting broke out between Athens and Sparta's allies. What followed was the Peloponnesian War, a 27-year conflict that would ultimately destroy the Golden Age and change Greek civilization forever. The war was like a boxing match between a heavyweight, Sparta, and a welterweight with longer reach, Athens. Sparta couldn't touch Athens behind its walls and naval supremacy, but Athens couldn't decisively defeat Sparta's superior army. The conflict dragged on with periodic truces, escalating brutality, and moments of genuine tragedy. The worst moment came when Athens besieged the neutral island of Melos and demanded submission. When the Melians refused, Athens killed all the men and enslaved all the women and children. It was a sign that the noble ideals of the Golden Age were cracking under the pressure of prolonged war. Athens, the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, was becoming just another imperial power willing to commit atrocities for strategic advantage. The war finally ended in 404 BCE, with Athens' complete defeat. The mighty Athenian navy was destroyed, the city's walls were torn down, and democracy was temporarily replaced by a Spartan-backed oligarchy. But Sparta's victory was Pyrrhic. The war had exhausted all the Greek city-states. The generation that had defeated Persia and created the Golden Age was gone, replaced by a generation that had only known civil war. Yet even in defeat, something remarkable had been created. The ideas born in Athens, democracy, philosophy, theater, historical writing, had spread throughout the Greek world. You can destroy a city, but you can't destroy an idea whose time has come.
While the southern Greek cities were exhausting themselves in endless wars, something interesting was happening in the north. Macedonia, a kingdom that the southern Greeks considered barely civilized, was getting organized. King Philip II of Macedon was like that kid in school who everyone ignored until he showed up to the reunion as a millionaire. He had studied Greek military tactics as a hostage in Thebes, then returned home and created the most effective army the ancient world had ever seen. Philip's phalanx was longer, deeper, and more flexible than anything the Greeks had. His cavalry was superbly trained. Most importantly, his army was professional, not citizen soldiers who wanted to go home for harvest season, but full-time warriors loyal to Macedonia. Between 359 and 336 BCE, Philip systematically conquered or allied with every Greek city-state. It was like watching a chess grandmaster play against beginners. Athens and Sparta could see what was happening, but couldn't stop it. The decisive battle came at Chaeronea in 338 BCE, where Philip's 18-year-old son Alexander led the cavalry charge that broke the Greek line. Greek independence died that day, though few realized it at the time. But Philip had bigger plans than just conquering Greece. He wanted to invade Persia and avenge the Persian invasions of 150 years earlier. Unfortunately for Philip, he was assassinated at his daughter's wedding in 336 BCE, killed by his own bodyguard in what was either a personal vendetta or a complex conspiracy.
This left the throne to that 20-year-old son, Alexander. Most people expected the Macedonian Empire to collapse. Greek cities rebelled. Barbarian tribes attacked the borders. Persian gold probably funded rebellions. Alexander's response was swift and terrifying. He marched south and destroyed the city of Thebes so completely that it ceased to exist for decades. He sold the entire population into slavery and left the ruins as a warning. It was like,
using a nuclear weapon to end an argument. Effective, but it made everyone else very, very careful about what they said next. With Greece secured, Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 BCE with about 35,000 troops. His goal was originally to liberate the Greek cities under Persian rule and maybe grab some territory. What happened instead was the most remarkable conquest in human history. Alexander won his first battle at the Granicus River, his second at Issus, where he defeated King Darius III personally, and his third at Gaugamela, where he shattered the Persian Empire forever. Each victory was more decisive than the last. But here's what made Alexander different from other conquerors. He didn't just defeat enemies, he adopted their cultures. He married a Bactrian princess. He wore a Persian royal dress. He encouraged his soldiers to marry local women. He founded cities that blended Greek and local traditions. This drove his Macedonian veterans crazy. They hadn't signed up to become Persians, they wanted to loot Persia and go home. But Alexander kept pushing east, into Afghanistan, over the Hindu Kush, into India. At the Hyspades River in India, Alexander fought his hardest battle against King Porus and his war elephants. The Greeks had never seen elephants in battle. Imagine facing tanks when you've only ever fought infantry. Alexander won, but his army had finally had enough. They refused to go further east. For the first time in his life, Alexander had to compromise. The man who had conquered the known world was stopped not by enemies, but by his own soldiers' exhaustion. The return journey was a nightmare. Alexander tried to march his army through the Gedrosian Desert, ancient Afghanistan and Pakistan. Thousands died of thirst, heat, and exhaustion. It was like Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, but with sand instead of snow. When they finally reached Babylon in 323 BCE, Alexander was planning new campaigns, maybe Arabia, maybe the Western Mediterranean. But his body, worn out by countless wounds and probably excessive drinking, gave out. He died at age 32, having conquered most of the known world in just 13 years. The empire immediately fragmented. Alexander's generals, called the Diadochi, or successors, spent the next 40 years fighting over the pieces. Eventually, three main kingdoms emerged: the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, and the Antigonids in Macedonia. But Alexander's real legacy wasn't political, it was cultural. He had spread Greek culture from Egypt to India. Thousands of new cities were founded with Greek names, Greek architecture, and Greek institutions. Local cultures absorbed Greek elements while contributing their own. This created what we call the Hellenistic world, a vast cosmopolitan civilization where a merchant could travel from Spain to Afghanistan and find people who spoke Greek, worshipped similar gods, and shared similar values. Greek became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, the common language of trade, diplomacy, and learning. It was like English today, but with more philosophers and fewer coffee shops. The Hellenistic kingdoms were incredibly wealthy and sophisticated. Alexandria in Egypt became the intellectual capital of the world with its famous library and museum. Pergamon in Asia Minor rivaled Athens as a center of art and learning. But these kingdoms were also politically unstable. They were ruled by Macedonian dynasties governing non-Greek populations, constantly fighting each other and gradually losing territory to new powers like Rome and Parthia. By the 2nd century BCE, a new power was rising in the West. Rome had conquered Italy and defeated Carthage, and now they were looking east at the wealthy but weakened Hellenistic kingdoms. The Romans admired Greek culture even as they conquered Greek lands. Captive Greece captured her savage conqueror, the Roman poet Horace wrote. Rome might have had the armies, but Greece had the culture. One by one, the Hellenistic kingdoms fell. Macedonia became a Roman province in 148 BCE. the Seleucid Empire collapsed under pressure from Rome and Parthia. Finally, in 30 BCE, the last Hellenistic kingdom, Ptolemaic Egypt, under Cleopatra VII, fell to Rome. Ancient Greece as an independent political entity was finished, but Greek culture was just getting started on its greatest conquest, the conquest of Rome itself, and through Rome, the entire Western world. Every educated Roman learned Greek. Roman gods merged with Greek gods. Roman architecture copied Greek models. Roman literature followed Greek forms. When Romans wanted to seem sophisticated, they quoted Greek philosophers and poets. And when Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, it did so in Greek. The New Testament was written in Greek. Early Christian theology was developed using Greek philosophical concepts. When the Roman Empire fell in the West, Greek culture survived in the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years. When Constantinople fell to the Turks in 1453, Greek scholars fled west, bringing their manuscripts and knowledge to Renaissance Europe. Today, 2,500 years after the Golden Age of Athens, we still live in a world shaped by ancient Greek ideas. Our democracies trace back to Athens. Our theaters perform Greek plays. Our philosophers grapple with questions first asked by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Every time you vote, you're participating in an Athenian innovation. Every time you watch a movie with a 3-act structure, you're experiencing Aristotelian dramatic theory. Every time you think about ethics, logic, or the nature of reality, you're walking paths first carved out by Greek thinkers. The ancient Greeks gave us the very concept of history. The word itself comes from the Greek historia, meaning inquiry. They taught us that the past could be studied rationally, that events had causes, and that we could learn from what came before. They also gave us the idea that human beings could govern themselves, that knowledge could be pursued for its own sake, and that individuals had dignity and rights that couldn't be taken away by kings or gods. Not bad for a collection of small cities that spent most of their time fighting each other. The ancient Greeks prove that you don't need to be the biggest or the strongest to change the world. You just need to have better ideas. And the best ideas, like democracy and philosophy and the pursuit of truth, are immortal. So the next time you vote, or think, or question authority, or demand evidence, or believe that human reason can solve problems, remember that you're channeling the spirit of ancient Greece. In that sense, ancient Greece never really ended. It just moved to wherever people are still asking the questions that Greeks taught us to ask. And that, from Bronze Age palaces to Alexander's world empire, is the entire history of ancient Greece.